Hei og velkommen til denne ukas episode av Stor i tro, en UiO-podcast. Og denne uka så har vi med oss Sam Chang, en legende fra USA som har vært ganske høyt oppe i lederskap i UiO. Og vi tror det blir veldig bra.
Ja, vi gleder oss til å høre han, så kjør episode.
Sam, welcome so much to Stor i tro. It's an honor to have you here, and welcome to Norway. How does it feel?
It's awesome. Love it. Every time I come here, I feel like this is what heaven looks like. I'm not going to lie.
It's so cool to have you here. And yeah, we had you speak here on and teach in a DTS a couple of years ago. And it's so inspiring to hear you speak. And so we're also super interested in hearing, like your life story. How has God moved in your life? And so we're super excited about that.
We've been like, we need Sam Chang to come to the podcast. That's a long time ago. And now we're finally here. So fun.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just take us down the path from where you were born?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was born 36 years ago in LA. My family, we grew up, like in LA, just kind of in my world was just a normal family. My mom actually went to a very charismatic church. And my dad at the time went to more of like a conservative church because he's a pastor's kid. So I kind of grew up with a little bit of familiarity with my mom, especially being in a lot of these evening meetings where like the Holy Spirit would really move. And I remember as a young kid at the time, I thought it was normal, but as I grew up, it was a little bit unusual where my mom would just drive, just speaking in tongues. and now I kind of understand that I think she was also kind of afraid. And so she would drive praying in tongues, and I just thought like, oh, like this is somewhat normal. And so I grew up with at least an understanding or a familiarity with the Holy Spirit moving, where, she would, pray over us, my brother and I, but also really just, contend over our family. And
How would that look like in that church with like the Holy Spirit moving? And, like, do you have any examples how?
Yeah. I mean, I was a kid, and so a lot of the times, a lot of us kids would be just playing, but sometimes, if you needed your mom, you would go into the sanctuary. And I remember as a kid, like, it was kind of scary.
Mm-hmm.
You walk into the sanctuary, it's like a little dark, and it'd be a bunch of like Korean ladies just like praying on their faces, and they would just pray for hours. And it was kind of like a normal Wednesday for us. And but I remember as a kid, when I would walk into the sanctuary, I do remember like sensing the presence of God in the sanctuary. And I was like, this is just different. There was something that I can tangibly recognize that was different to where other places, that I've been. And I didn't have language to articulate it. But as I grew older, I knew like that was the presence of God.
But how was that then, like in the youth and like growing up then? How did it mean that much to you then? And did you then get the words for it and understand it?
Yeah, I think as I grew up, we didn't have necessarily like great teaching or anything like that for the kids. And so when I was 10, we ended up moving to North Carolina. So it was like kind of like on the opposite side of the country. And I remember, we didn't necessarily, like, we grew up in more of a conservative church when we went to North Carolina. So it wasn't like very common. But starting when I was in high school even, it started to happen a little bit more where we would go and we had these retreats where these guys would come in. I remember Corey Russell came through one time and everyone was just like, who is this guy? Like, he was just so different and so unusual, and the authority that he walked in with the Lord. And I remember thinking, like, I've not heard anyone speak about God the way he does. And there was also, Jay Thomas, who's a worship leader, and he would come through as well, and they would minister and they would pray for people, and I was so shocked at the difference in how they talked about God. And so I remember thinking, like, one, I feel like I've been here before, but at the same time, I was like, I just want what they have. They know something about God I've never seen before in church.
Were you able to like point that this is how they talk differently about God, or was it like there's just something here that is different?
I didn't necessarily know that I could put two and two together at that point. I just knew, like, man, there was just something different. There was something that was, if I were to put language to it at that time, I would say they've been somewhere with God that I've not seen many people go before.
So growing up in a charismatic church and eventually moving to the other side of the country, because there's a lot of church hurt from charismatic churches and normal churches and stuff. Can you see why that would happen? And do you see, what's your take on that problem in that sense?
Yeah, great question. I definitely have had some painful experiences growing up in the church, and it at one point I actually stopped going in high school. So my parents got divorced when I was 13, and in that process, I think out of the good intentions of his heart, my pastor got quite involved and wanted to help. And in the process of his own, I think, journey, he made some pretty wild accusations about my mom and accused her of essentially that the divorce was her fault, and told her. And, the church kind of believed that my mom was having an affair on my dad, which was not true. And my pastor believed it and told her, and essentially told her that I would never go to college and I would never make it in life, and that my younger brother would need counseling for the rest of his life because of her decisions.
Whoa.
And it was a pretty painful experience for me, because it was someone that I trusted in and I had looked up to, and it led to probably years of myself being really angry with God and angry with my leaders and angry with the church. And in this whole process, I would say for 5 years or so, after my parents had gotten divorced, my mom never left the church, even though, essentially everyone kind of had dragged her reputation through the mud. Like, they've made some really unfair assumptions about her and her character. And I asked her, I remember, like, years later, I was like, why did you never leave? Like, why did you stay? And she told me, she's like, the Lord never told me that I was allowed to. And just because it's hard doesn't mean I should go. And I remember thinking, like, that's like the craziest thing I've ever heard. I was like, I was so ready to press eject, as a kid. And I was like, this is so unfair. And I was so mad. And, but it really was I had a lot of respect for the way my mom handled that whole situation, how painful it was. And years later, like maybe 2 years later, I essentially was not following the Lord. I was really like broken. I was depressed. I had suicidal thoughts. And my mom, she was like, hey, I am going to force you to go to this retreat. And I was like, I don't think that's going to be a good idea. And she was like, no, you're going to go. She's like, I'm kicking you out of the house. And I was like, I just remember like, all right, like, you want to play hardball? Like, I can do that. And so she was like, yeah, you're not allowed to stay at the house, but you can stay at this retreat. So I was like, okay. So I went to this retreat, and in the front of this retreat, as all like these, high school kids are coming in, there's like 400 of them, I smoked a blunt. And I was like, kick me out. What are you going to do? And the guy who was leading this retreat ended up sitting down with me, and he was like, hey, I've known you for many years. Tell me what's going on. And I ended up sitting down with him, and I was just angry. So I was just, just saying all these things. This is not right. This is not right. And just kind of going off on all this stuff that happened. And he didn't necessarily like give me any answers or tell me like I was wrong or right. He just listened. And at the end, he just said, but will you allow the Lord to do what he wants in your life? And I remember like thinking, I don't know. And so the second night of that retreat, I was still kind of like really resistant and reserved and just like, I don't want this. And the second night of this retreat, one of the guys that was leading or facilitating the retreat ended up giving a word to me in front of all the guys at the retreat. And it was totally spot on. I don't remember all the details, but he had basically given me this really powerful word. And I remember in that moment, the Lord urged me. It was like almost like it wasn't like he spoke to me. I just knew exactly what I needed to do. I didn't have a theology for it. I didn't have a understanding for it, but I knew that I needed to reconcile with that pastor that had hurt, like that said all that stuff. And I remember in that moment, I had this decision, and I was so like, I was shaking because I was like, I don't want to let this go. Like he was so hurtful. And I turned around almost before I could make a decision. He was right there. And I remember turning around, and it like almost spilled out of my mouth. And I said, will you forgive me? And I just wept. And I just remember in that moment, all of this weight lift off of my chest. And I remember thinking like, I'm being like set free of all of this bitterness and resentment and anger. And I just wept, and he wept, and he was like, I'm so sorry. I should never have said those things. I'm so in the wrong. And
I would think you would turn around and like, I hate you.
I
you
know.
wrecked my life. But you like response is, I forgive you.
Yeah, and I actually asked for his forgiveness.
Yeah, that was also weird. Like, I thought you were going to turn and like, I forgive you kind of thing.
Yeah. So I did too. I mean, everything you're saying is what I thought. Except when I turned around, what came out of my mouth was, will you forgive me? When I was like shocked. I was like, I don't know what's happening. And, I honestly just think it was like the Lord just helping me, because of course he was wrong. Of course the things that he did was not okay. But the way I responded was also not okay. The way I had a responsibility over my own actions and what I did as well. And before I had understanding, like the Lord just helped me. So I realized that I had my own part to play in everything that happened between myself and the pastor. And I think looking back now, I'm like really grateful that the Lord kind of led me in that way, where I had to figure this out with my pastor. And in some ways, I've definitely felt, really sympathetic and really in one sense able to meet on a level with a lot of our students who've had church hurt and who've experienced a lot of pain with their churches. And I was probably the last person on earth that thought ever I would want to be going to church or working with church. And to even think about having a heart for the church was probably the last thing ever in my life that I thought I would have.
Because I feel like that's one of the main issues, maybe people that are growing up in Christian families or something, that they get hurt by the church or people saying they're representing Jesus. And then instead of when that person does something wrong, they blame Jesus as much as that person.
Yeah.
It's like me trying to play Mozart on piano. It would sound horrible. It's like people playing Jesus poorly.
Sure.
But like, what would your would you resolve that? Say you have church hurt or something. Like, what would be the way to get out of that, if that makes sense, instead of leaving your faith?
I think, in my personal opinion, everyone's story is going to be different, and there are going to be, not all pain is the same. And so I can't necessarily say like the solution is the same, because every person's journey and what they've gone through requires a solution that really helps them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, like for myself, and what I went through was a lot of betrayal with my pastor, and there was other incidences where he really did betray my trust, and he did it very intentionally almost, and that was almost as hard or hurtful as the stuff and the accusations that he had made. But in the process of it, I would say that what's going to help me now, and what I would encourage to, any of the listeners that may have any of the church hurt, is forgiveness is so powerful, because when we live in unforgiveness, we create our own prison cell.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that we're punishing the person that we're bitter against. But all that it is it's creating a prison cell for ourselves to live inside. And there are some amazing authors who talk about this, where they basically reference that your heart has this basically beautiful way that it doesn't selectively choose who it trusts and who it doesn't, or who it allows in and who it keeps out. That when you begin to close off your heart, it closes off your heart to everyone, including God. And the only way to get through that is to make the dangerous choice to trust again, which is probably the scariest thing for most people, but it is actually the only way to become healthy and whole.
Yeah, so you kind of have to you have to choose to either close down and like be really closed, or to risk being hurt and open up.
That's
like,
right. That's exactly it.
I remember, I think it was you that said it 2 years ago, or someone else, but they said that unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
That's right.
And I think that's crazy how like it wrecks your own heart being bitter towards that person, and you think it's affecting them, but it's most likely not.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's exactly what it's a great way to put it. And
it's your words, I think, so.
Yeah, I mean, I may have said it. But when I was processing everything with the hurt from my pastor and all of that, again, I would just really encourage all the listeners, because unfortunately we do live in a time and an age where church hurt is so common, and it's so unfortunate, because it shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be the mess that we have to clean up. It shouldn't be the point of where it's an unfortunate reality that we live in a time and an age that leaders in the church and those that are in authority fall short in the way that they do. And I think we have to acknowledge that it's not okay. It's not okay that they did those things. It's not okay that, they've really missed the mark. And, it was interesting. They had an interview with Tim Keller before he passed, and they asked him, in the cases where a pastor, let's say, sins, where it was like sexual immorality, and he falls in that area, can he ever be restored again? Is it okay for him to lead again in a church? And he took some time to answer the question, but in short, he said no. I don't think that it's right. Not that it's right or wrong, but he says, I don't think it's best for that leader to step into that position again, because he's essentially abdicated a lot of his influence and responsibility of representing and leading in that way. And even if he goes to a different city or a church, those decisions have ramifications. And so I think that in one sense, again, I don't have authority in this, but there does need to be a sense of greater accountability for churches. There does need to be a greater sense of transparency in some of the decisions that are made, I think, overall. But at the same time, for us, especially for the younger generation, is that I truly believe God is raising up godly leaders that are ready to fill in that place, that really do have a passion and a conviction to live in godliness and to live in a real sense of, not just communicating well and leading well in the sense of, charisma, but really walking in the character that represents the God that we serve.
So you're having this moment on youth camp, or asking for forgiveness for your pastor.
Yeah.
He ends up asking for forgiveness himself. And then what kind of happens afterwards? You said his weight lifted off. How was your life after that?
Yeah. My life, I also, in that moment, I felt it was really clear that I was supposed to do this discipleship training school. My friend, he was a little bit older than I was, and he had come back from doing his discipleship training school. And I remember seeing him and thinking, he is a totally different person. He was absolutely transformed. And the way that he was I thought it was a different guy. That's how radically different he was. And so I remember thinking, I would love to be able to have an experience to go and experience what he had. And he would tell us crazy stories where he went into Fiji on outreach. And at the time, I didn't know where Fiji was. And I thought that they just deliver water. And I was like, he came back from this experience and he was talking about how they went into a hospital. They prayed for all these people, and he watched as he prayed for this man that had cancer in his face, and it started to disappear as he prayed for him. And I was like, I was shocked, because I was like, I think the only thing I've prayed for is my food. and for me to not be lonely and die alone. And so for him to share these stories, I was just so shocked and in awe of God that was so much bigger than I could have ever imagined. Oh. And so when I had this powerful moment with my pastor, in that moment, I also was very convinced. I was like, okay, I'm supposed to go and do this discipleship training school. And I think 2 months later, I went and did it.
How was your experience with DTS, YWAM, and that's also, some would say maybe charismatic, but not necessarily. But how was it meeting?
Yeah, great question. So I had no idea what YWAM was, no idea what DTS was. And truth be told, even though my friend went, he was trying to explain it to me, and I could not understand. I could not put two and two together. I just was like, I don't know what this is. I just know that he's different. And at the time, we didn't really have great website. They didn't have a lot of photos of what it was like. And I also didn't really look into it because I was just kind of like, well, God told me to go. I'm just going to go. And in my mind, I thought I was going to show up at a white sand Hawaiian beach and sit by a coconut tree and listen to a teacher tell me about Jesus. And I thought that's what it's going to be like. I show up into Kona, Hawaii, land on what was the most kind of surprising landing, because it was all black rock. And I was like, what is this stuff? I was like, where's the sand? And I thought that they legitimately landed on the wrong place. And I go to the campus, and it's huge. It's 40 acres that they've developed. And I was like, I don't know where I am. This is crazy. And we went to class, and initially it wasn't, very charismatic. We had charismatic moments. But definitely I was just like kind of shocked. I was like, wow, but to me, what was the most, impressionable or impactful moment that set my heart, because I came in kind of guarded because of all of my church hurt, and I was kind of ready to not be disappointed, but I was kind of, like, okay, this could happen. I don't know what these guys are like. Are they going to be like my pastor? Who knows? Because that was my only experience with leadership in church. And I showed up early, which I wasn't supposed to. And I was sleeping on my staff's couch. And I woke up in the morning, and it was like 7:30, and none of my staff were in the room. And I thought, they got raptured. And I was like, I missed it. I was like, I've been left behind. But I was like, no, where'd they go? And then all of a sudden I heard some of these voices outside. And so I kind of like got up and I looked outside, and all my staff are out there on their own, just praying for the school. They just wanted to take time, and they were all just praying together. And I remember thinking as an 18-year-old, they're the real deal. They take this so seriously, and they're praying for me. And I was like, I'm in the right place. And this is exactly where I should be. And, week by week, God just kept meeting me in these amazing ways.
What are some of the moments that you remember the most from that time?
I would say probably the most memorable that a lot of people like hearing about is praying for outreach locations. So they gave us 10 locations that we can pray for. And I was overwhelmed. I was so nervous because I was like, I don't know how to hear God's voice. I was totally under this impression. I was like, out of all the things that I feel like God would do, I just wasn't sure that God wanted to speak to me. I don't know. I just felt like I wasn't good enough. I wasn't, spiritual enough. I wasn't reading my Bible enough. And so hearing God's voice to me was intimidating and scary. And my friend at the time, he kind of was a staff, and he came in the room and he was like, hey, I know this sounds crazy. I was praying for you today, Sam, but I felt like God wanted you to pray outside as you're praying for outreach locations. And I thought, what a weird thing to say. That's such an odd thing to suggest. And I was like, okay, thanks for sharing that, weirdo. But I was like, well, I have nothing to lose. So that night I was like, all right, well, I guess I'll just go outside and pray. And I was like walking around aimlessly because I was like, well, I can't go inside to pray. And I was like, what do I do? And I walked around campus, and I came across these 2 lawn chairs, and I was like, oh, I guess I can just sit here. So I sat down in the lawn chair, and it reclines back. So I'm looking up at the sky, and I had this thought. Didn't know if it was God, just had a thought. What if God wanted to talk to me through shooting stars? And I thought, what a weird thing. And then as I thought that, I remember seeing this tiny little streak go across the sky, but it was really at the bottom of the horizon. So I wasn't sure if it was something in my eye or if it was a shooting star. So I was like, I don't know if that was a shooting star or not. So I was like, I don't know. And then I was like, what if I just asked for something crazy? And so I painted this thing across the sky, and I was like, God, if you want to speak to me through shooting stars, would you send one here? And I did it right in the middle of the sky where I was looking. And then I waited. And I thought to myself, what a dumb thing to ask. And then as I'm sitting there, a shooting star goes across from right where I drew it in the exact same direction. And I was shocked. I was like, oh my gosh, it happened. He did it. I was blown away. And I was like, okay, maybe it was coincidence. So I thought, if that was really you, would you do it again? And then as soon as I said it, another shooting star goes across the sky.
Oh.
And I was like, okay, I think he's totally doing this. I was like, I'm in a moment, with God. And so I started praying through the outreach locations one by one. The first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one, the fifth one. And it got down and it got to the eighth one. And I was like, is it this one? And then another shooting star goes across the sky. And I was like, okay. I was like, maybe it's this. And then, of course, my mind is going crazy. So I was like, maybe the timing was off. So I was like, I'll just trick him. And I was like, all right, is that you, God? And then another shooting star goes across the sky. And I was like, all right, well, maybe it's number 9. So I was like, is it number 9? Is it number 10? Is it number 5? So I'm like kind of throwing it off out there, throwing out random numbers. And then I was like, okay, well, is it number 8? And then another shooting star goes across the sky. I'm pretty sure I saw like 7 or 8 shooting stars that night where I drew it as I'm asking the Lord about my outreach location. And that night was, obviously incredibly memorable because I was like shocked. I was like, why would God want to speak to me? And he would do all of that to send little pebbles into the atmosphere to get my attention. And I was just so in awe of that night. I was like, man, I can't believe it that he would do that.
So cool that you're kind of sitting alone. So it's not like you're sharing the moment with someone either.
No.
So you can't be super excited either because you're...
Right. Because I'm like, what if someone's looking at me right now?
Yeah, so in YWAM, like one of the key values is hearing God's voice.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's a lot of people that don't think about firstly when like, I'm a Christian, but so I'm hearing God's voice.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on, not that we need to go out and look for star shootings, but like YWAM is preaching this message a lot, that God wants to speak to us. What are some key areas on this?
Yeah. Well, I think number one is the primary way that he obviously communicates to us is through his word. And we see that all throughout Scripture, God's speaking with his people. And through his word, we have this gift where God's word is available to us. And so any way that God speaks to us will be confirmed through the word of God. At the same time, I totally have a firm belief that God's always communicating to us. Sometimes we recognize it, sometimes we don't. And he's much better at speaking than we are at listening. And it's just a matter of beginning to, I think, really say, okay, like, I want to know what you're saying to me. And at times, I've heard stories where, God will speak to people in nature, and they'll go on a hike, or they'll be, taking a walk or on a run, and they would hear these thoughts that are from the Lord. And I've heard stories where people are just alone in their room, and there is a real sense of peace that they would encounter, and then they would have a thought or a verse that would come up. And, like, I'll give you a story, for example, that someone was praying. They were just having a quiet time, and all of a sudden, as they're just spending time with the Lord in their room, they just had this thought, reach out to this friend. And they weren't necessarily like friends, but it was someone that she knew in her high school. And this person was like a Satanist. Like, she did not love God. And she felt like this thought, tell her that I love her. And she thought that would be the last thing that I would ever want to say to this person. I care about my life. I don't think this is a good idea. But she just thought she couldn't get it out of her mind. And so she just kind of builds the courage and gives her a call and says, hey, I know we don't really talk much. I kind of was having time with God and felt he was bringing you up to mind and wanted me to tell you that he loves you. And immediately this girl on the other line was like, how did you know to call me? And she was like, I don't know. I just was in my room. I just felt like I needed to. And this girl was like, I was walking through the mall and I stumbled across an album by Hillsong that someone just left there, picked it up, not knowing what it was. And I've been playing it in my room and I'm crying and I'm not sure what's happening to me.
Huh.
And then you called.
That's
Whoa.
wild.
And that moment, this girl ends up giving her life to the Lord. This other girl ends up driving and starting spending time with her. And she ends up getting discipled. And those moments, you know, I don't think it's just coincidence that she would hear something like that or have this thought that she couldn't get out of her mind. I think that, and I really believe God loves to speak to us still to this day.
Cool. And then after, what is the next thing happening in your life then after DTS or in DTS even?
Yeah.
You went on that outreach, didn't you?
I did. I went to New Zealand.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. We saw just incredible like moments of just the Lord. And that's really where my heart for New Zealand came alive, and it changed my life. I ended up doing a Bible school after, so I felt like the Lord told me to do a Bible school after my DTS. Came back, and it was in my School of Biblical Studies in Hawaii that I went on an extended season where I felt like the Lord really was highlighting to spend extra time with him, which I thought was very unusual because I was studying the Bible all day. And so when I felt like God was like, I want you to spend time with me, I was like, what do you think I'm doing every day? And he was like, no, like not just studying. I just want to be with you. And so I was like, okay, like, I'll just, go up and maybe spend time in the morning. And he was like, yep. And also the afternoons and the evenings. And I was like, oh. And so then 3 times a day I would go and spend time with the Lord in the prayer room. And they weren't like, super glamorous. I most of the time was like trying not to sleep or I'm not sure what to say. But I just did it faithfully. And I went to the prayer room, and I remember doing this for probably maybe a month or two. And one Monday morning, I remember so clear, I like woke up and was in worship, and I didn't finish my homework that I needed to get done that day. And I felt like the Lord was like, I want you to come and spend time with me again now. And I was like, I just was here this morning, just went to worship, and now you want me to go back. And he's like, yeah, I want you to come right now. And I was just like, this irresistible urge that I was like, I just felt drawn almost. And I was like, okay. So I walked over the prayer room, kind of like, this is interesting. Walked in the prayer room, and those moments where you're like, I'm in a moment where kind of time almost stands still. And I was in a moment with God. I walked into the prayer room, I fell on my face, and I just started weeping. And I was like, I don't know what's happening. And then in my mind, I saw this movie. It was like a movie being played as my eyes were closed, and I can see it happening, but obviously my eyes are closed. And I saw this car being driven down a highway. I was in the passenger seat, and God was in the driver's seat, and he was leading me. And I was like, this is amazing. God's in control of my life. He's taking me where I need to go, and I'm just on for the ride. And in that moment, I felt this clear thought. Look at the steering wheel. And I was like, oh. So I look, and I'm reaching across on the passenger side, and I'm gripping the steering wheel with my hands. And I heard him say, even though you let me in the driver's seat, you've not given me full control. It's either I who drive or you, and you need to choose now. And I was like, this really took a turn. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then I started being reminded of all of the memories of where my life was without God, of being so depressed, of being suicidal, of being so like empty without him. I was like, I don't want that life. I don't want a life without God. I don't want to. And I thought I was following God. I was like, I'm like doing this Bible school. I'm spending time with him. But I remember in the moment, I was like, I still have elements of control in my life where I'm still trying to be in control of where I'm going, of my future. So I said, okay. And I remember in that moment, I relinquished control. I surrendered my future. And I said, all right, God, you can lead my life. And then in that moment, he said, go to Afghanistan. And I was like, excuse me? I was like, we're not going to like ease into this? I was like, what? Why? Like, why Afghanistan? I was like, I've never wanted to go there. And I don't know if you remember, God, but they're currently in a war. And they also just killed a bunch of Korean missionaries. And I was like, I don't really want to go there. And he said, it's a time for you to be in the wilderness with me. And I was like, I don't know what that means. Can you give me a Bible verse? And then again, immediately I heard Hosea 2:14. And I was like, what is that? Turn to Hosea 2:14. It says, therefore I will allure her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her and care for her.
Whoa.
And I was like, okay, so you might be saying something. It's like, I think we're on to something here. And I was like, okay, like, I don't know what this means, but obviously he's speaking to me about Afghanistan. And so I come out of this encounter and I kind of get up and I see my friend in the prayer room and I look over and I was like, hey, can you pray for me? And he looks at me and he goes, Afghanistan, it's God, do it. I was like, what? I was like, thank you, but don't ever do that again. I was like, that was so scary. I was like, how did you do that? And he was like, when you were in your encounter, he was like, the Lord told me the same thing.
Whoa.
And I was like, wow, okay. What? And so I walked out of that prayer room and I was like, okay, I'm convinced. So I gave the Lord kind of like, I was like, I want my parents to release me to go. And I want my church to say yes, which again, you know, the story. And so my church to commission me was a miracle. And I called my parents and I told them, I was like, I had this kind of wild encounter with God. And my mom immediately was like, I'm not sure. And I was like, okay. And in the moment I was like, all right, I guess I'm not going, you know, like, I'm like, it's okay if she says no, but I was like, I'm just being obedient. And I was like, well, why don't you pray? And she was like, well, I'm having a small group tonight with some of my friends. So I'll bring it up to them and we'll pray about it tonight. I was like, okay. I get a call first thing the next morning and it's my mom. And she picks up, or I pick up, and I can tell that she's been crying. And she's like, I had my small group last night and we're all weeping. I told them about what God said over your life, and God convicted every one of us mothers that we still had control over our children's life.
Oy, oy, oy.
And the Lord told her, is he mine or is he yours? And she said, I had to surrender the right to have control over your life as your mother. And all of us, we've been weeping and we prayed through the night. And she said, it's God, you have to go. And I was like, dang it. And then I was like, all right, in the church. And then I ended up telling the church. And at the time, there was another pastor who was there. The one that I told you about was no longer there. And this other pastor, for some reason, just didn't like me. And I thought that he was supportive and was going to be helpful. And I went into a meeting with all the elders at my church to tell them about this thing about Afghanistan. And essentially, he was the greatest critic of me going. Mm-hmm. And he asked like just really hurtful questions. Like, how do you really know this is God? And how do you know you're not just making this up? And, how do you know that you're even ready to go? And they just had this whole thing for mission, and all the other elders there were ready to say yes, except this pastor that I thought was my friend. And I thought, I was so like, again, like, gosh, like, why? Like, I thought he was going to help me. And I remember just in this meeting feeling so confused and betrayed. And I broke down and I was like, I don't have a plan B here, guys. Like, I'm just trying to obey God. And this is what I felt like he said. And I'm just asking that you'd bless me and commission me and support me. And I walked out of that meeting, and miraculously they said yes. And they said, you're supposed to go. And there was like other miracles where my passport didn't come in on time, and I was leaving for the airport at 12 o'clock because my flight was leaving at like 2 or 2:30. And literally as I'm leaving, I had no passport, and my passport came in as I'm in the car. The mailman showed up. Oh, yeah. And I grabbed the passport, went to the airport just in time to get out. And things like that, where the Lord just continually provided the last moment, or he just came up miraculously. And I went to Afghanistan in 2009, was there for about like 7 months.
Yeah, how was that?
It was crazy. We were in a city called Mazar-e-Sharif, and it was next to the German army base. I taught English, and my whole premise was I wanted to establish a house of prayer there. And I failed a lot. It was overwhelming, culture shock, living in a country. I was like, this is so different to anything I've ever been in. And yet I really saw the goodness of God as I was there. I saw my heart really begin to fall in love and love the people of Afghanistan. And I was just so, again, blown away. I feel like I came in with like, well, God's obviously sending me there because he's got something for me to do. And I'm going to do something amazing in Afghanistan. And I left Afghanistan 7 months later, recognizing, it's actually more about me receiving something from them more than me giving them anything. And I walked away humbled, and really just in awe of the people, but also the Lord.
Cool.
I feel like that's often like a thing happening to missionaries going. Like I remember Dan Bauman, when he was in Afghanistan, he was like, this is not necessarily where he needs you to be, but where he wants to be with you, like spend time with you. Yeah. I feel like that's the same thing here going, you're going to Afghanistan just to grow in your own personal relationship with God. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. Side question, and this is me playing the devil's advocate here. Yeah. But you talked about like God wanting to spend time with you. Yeah. Not just in Bible studies and worship and stuff, but spend time with you. What if like you have packed schedules, like you have hobbies, you have friends, you have girlfriends, whatever. Yeah. And like, and then this is me playing the devil's advocate again. Like if you think it's boring almost. Right. Or like, yeah, I can spend my time here, but time is valuable, Of course. What's your take on that?
One is, I totally get it. I'm with you. I mean, I'm so easily distracted, and I wasn't the guy that like wanted to spend time with God. I wanted to go play basketball. I wanted to go and play with, like, hang out with my friends, and it was the last thing I wanted to do. And so again, like I said, it wasn't like every moment I walked in that prayer room, I was like, wow, this is everything I wanted to do. Most of the time I'm like, I am so hungry, and I would think about cheeseburgers to fries, like, and I'm like, and then I'm thinking about the basketball game, and I'm like, oh, I should be praying. So I'm like, all right, like, so it was a lot of that, but my intention as I'm, in the prayer room, I'm praying, and I'm just doing my best to spend time with him. And oftentimes I think I have an idealized image in my mind of this perfect quiet time. And I don't know if you've ever, hung out, like, you make plans with your friends and you have this perfect hangout in your mind. And you're like, we're going to go do this, and we're going to go do this, and then we're going to go do this. And it never happens that way. You show up and someone's late, and then we're going to go do this, but that place is closed. And then you end up thinking about plan C, and then plan C wasn't actually fun. And then you're like, let's go watch this movie, but that movie wasn't actually that great. And the whole thing just turns out to be a total flop. But months later, you'll laugh about it, and guess what? You still made a memory out of failed plans, and your friends, you drew closer even though your plans never worked out. And I think it's the same way with our relationship with God, that even though it may not necessarily be like this perfect, picturesque, quiet time, the point of it is connection. It's not about accomplishment. It's about connection. And at the same time, I also, as I've understand that people are busy, and it doesn't need to be, and that specific season of my life isn't how I do every day. It was a specific season. And I think that it's okay if it's 5 minutes, that we just take and we spend time with God. The point of it is, again, connection. And, there's a few amazing authors that I would highly recommend. One of them being John Mark Comer, and then another guy named Tyler Staton. And they have some incredible things of really how to connect with God in a busy world. We have so many opportunities to be distracted. We have so many reasons to do anything but spend time with God, that we have so many options. But when we take the time and we just spend time with him, I think it just means so much to the heart of God, because out of all the options, you chose him. And it doesn't need to be, again, overly complicated. John Mark Comer was talking about even at lunch, during your lunch break, to take 5 minutes and just take time. You can open your hands and you can just thank God. Thank God for what you have. Thank God for in sincerity of what he's done. And then just connect with him. And just, God, I just want to connect with you. I want to know, and I want to be aware of your presence in the middle of my crazy workday, in the middle of me, let's say behind a computer, working away. I want to connect with you. And I think that we would be delightfully surprised by how quickly and how just willingly God would meet us in those moments.
So then to go even deeper in this, like, how would you avoid almost comparison to other people? Because I have some friends, they're like up in 6 or 5:30 in the morning spending time, and it seems like it's the bread of life they're getting, and they were hungry and now they're full, and you just see this joy, and this a quiet time for them is not boring. It's they love it, and it's so necessary for them. Like, how do you avoid comparing yourself and your own relationship to God to other people, if you get the question?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I think that sometimes, when it comes to our spiritual life, we don't have a measurement of how do you measure your spiritual life. We have the fruit of your spiritual life, which is the evidence of God in you, and the fruit of the Spirit of us walking out in these areas. But we don't necessarily have a way to measure your spiritual life other than your disciplines. So then sometimes it's easy for us to fall into a trap where, for me, I remember when I used to live with a guy named Andy Bird. He's mega disciplined. It doesn't matter what's happening. He, has 7 children, and they could be awake through the night, and he would still get up at 4 a.m. and still spend time with God. Didn't matter. He just goes through his day. And I'm like, he's a robot. He's just not real. He's not human. And, he would work out and just do the craziest things and be so fit. And it was really frustrating because I was like, he's better at me than everything. Like there's really nothing that I can beat him in. And maybe that I can eat more than he does, you know?
Got him.
Yeah. And so I was just like so like frustrated. I was like, what the heck? And so living under the constant, like when I lived with him, I'd wake up and be like, great. I woke up at 6:30, but I woke up feeling like a failure because he's been up for 2 hours having time with the Lord. Now he's like making breakfast for his kids and having time with them. And here I am, just a single failure. And it was so great for me to be able to recognize, wow, like I'm trying to be like this professional Christian, go from point A to point Z. And it's almost like the guy that like picks up, you know, working out for the first time and they're trying to lift 315 pounds off the bench for the first time. And you're like, this is just not helpful. It's not good for you. It's not going to help you. It's just going to destroy you. And we are in such a rush to get to our destination because we live in a hurried life, in a accelerated life, that we want to microwave our spiritual life. And God is not in a hurry. God is not in a rush. And he wants us to just, it's okay to be where we're at, to just connect with him. So like for me, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way or in a, I'm not trying to say this to be like offensive, but when I'm relating with my kids, I don't expect to have mature conversations with my children. It's just not where they're at yet. They have mature moments and I'm so blown away, but he's 7 and so I'm not going to talk to him about politics and, you know, like I'm not going to relate to him on some of those things because that's not where he's at. Where he's at is he wants to play with me and I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to provide for him as a father to play with my son. And right now that's usually Legos and Pokemon and, you know, and so we're going to talk about where Charizard is at and, you know, like, and I'm happy to do that. Why? Because it delights his heart and we're connecting. And I think that for any of you guys that are listening, don't over pressure yourself to be where you're not and to celebrate where you are. And the celebration is you're connecting with God and there are many people around you that are not. And God celebrates the fact that you're connecting with him and he loves it. And he's so proud of the fact that we just said yes. He's so proud of the fact that we woke up and chose him. Whether we slept through our alarm clock, whether we got up at 4 a.m. or whether it's 9 o'clock in the morning, it doesn't matter. The fact is we're connecting. There was this guy who talked in Kona and he shared this story that I thought was so beautiful. And, you know, he's a guy in ministry, has done amazing things. And he was feeling a little frustrated because he just wasn't having enough time with the Lord. And he was just like, I'm not getting enough time. I'm not spending enough time with God. And I just wish I had more time. And, you know, he had kids that were young like myself. And one of his kids was napping. And they're like a infant, like maybe a year old at most, and he was holding his baby and he was just looking at this baby and he was like, gosh, I just love his little toes. You know, like when you see like a baby, like their fingers and their toes, you're just like, they're so small and delicate and there's something beautiful about it. It's so cute. And he was just like, those are my baby's toes, you know? And he was just loving it, you know? And then the next morning, because babies don't always sleep well. And he totally slept through his alarm, didn't have time with God. And he was just like, I did it again. And he heard this whisper from the Lord. And the Lord's like, I love your little toes. And he was like, what? And he was like, I know you didn't get to spend that time with me, but I love that you even had the desire to. And maybe you didn't have the capacity to wake up because you're in fatherhood right now. But I want you to know I still take delight over your life as I get to watch you sleep.
So now we know that you have been a leader in Kona and Hawaii for many years. Then how did you come into that? And How was that journey?
In 2014 until 2017, and then we came back to Kona. I had a dream where in this dream my base leader told me, Sam, your assignment is finished in New Zealand, it's time to go home to Kona. And my wife at that same time, because I was teaching in a DCS in the Cook Islands, she was driving and felt like, okay, your assignment is finished, you can go home. And I called her and I was like, I had this crazy dream. And she was like, oh, I had this crazy word. And it was the exact same. And we both felt it.
Cool.
And so we moved back to Kona. And it was all just kind of invitation. And I landed in Kona. I think my wife had a dream where she was serving Darlene. And then I had a dream where Andy was asking me to lead training. And then that next day I had a meeting with Andy, and then he asked me to lead training. And I was like, I'll pray about it. I was like, yeah, interestingly enough, I had a dream that you would do this. He's like, oh, great. And so I ended up taking training for Fire and Fragrance. And it was always like a bit of a dream. I never thought that I would actually get to, so I was really excited. And yeah, it was crazy. You know, I definitely was baptized by fire, had some really hard situations that we talked about. But you know, in it, I learned so much. And yeah, was humbled a lot in the midst of it.
Yeah, did you kind of feel ready for that task? When
heck no. No. I still don't in some ways. I'm like, you know, where I think the big term that people use a lot now is called the imposter syndrome. And, you know, I felt like in some days I'm like, man, I am so not the right person for this. And then other days I'm like, you know, I think I can get through today, you know, like, so I never felt like I was ready or qualified, but I definitely was pretty surprised at the being just serving for many years, how much that translated to what the Lord taught me when I was leading.
Yeah, what were some what are some key lessons you learned through these years?
Yeah. I think probably the first and foremost was people are messy and leading people is messy. And leading people can be some of the most challenging, but also most rewarding things that you would ever do. And learning how to believe in people that haven't yet learned to believe in themselves was something that will always cherish.
If you would like summarize then, after years of experience now, if you would summarize a leader's responsibility, what would that be?
A leader's responsibility is to go last and to serve. Is to do the hard thing. And oftentimes the hard things are not visible. The hard thing is often being misunderstood. The hard things are serving in areas that you never thought that you would. And in some ways, you know, like when I became that leader, I also was invited to take greater ownership. And ownership not just of the schools or the functions or the programs, but ownership over the property in essence, making sure the trash was taken out, making sure that the cars were taken care of and the office space was clean. And it was taking ownership over many areas that I never thought at the time. And I think looking back over the years, I've been really impressed by who the Lord brought to us, if that makes sense. And the gifts of God, like Zane, for instance, and who he is and who he's become. I was just blown away, like the gift of God that he is.
But you also said that you were a couple of years in New Zealand.
That's right. Yeah.
What were you doing in New Zealand?
Yeah, so I told you I had that dream when I left New Zealand.
Yeah.
I also had a dream when I went to New Zealand. It was like in 2013. I was at the time living in Andy's, and I had a dream where Andy was in this dream with me, and he was like, Sam, God's doing amazing things in New Zealand, and there is something brewing in this nation of New Zealand. We have to get to New Zealand. And he started getting really passionate in this dream. And he was like, we have to go and serve the DTS in New Zealand. And he grabbed me by the shoulders and he said, Sam, I need you to go to New Zealand. And then I woke up and I was like, I wonder what that means. And so, no, I was like, that's insane. I was like, that's crazy. I didn't at the time have any plans to go there. So I went outside because he was working as he usually does. And I was like, Andy, I had this crazy dream. Can I just tell you real quick? And I told him, and he was like, yeah, Sam, sounds like God. He's like, I was just talking with the New Zealand base leaders, and they were asking us for people to go and serve their DTS. He was like, you should really pray about it. And I was like, okay. And a few months later, maybe a year later, I moved out there, and I invited, I think 6 other people, but 4 maybe ended up coming with me from our community. And in my mind, though, no one would say this, I was doing the next best thing in YWAM. I was being commissioned out of the community, going and starting something in New Zealand. And I thought, I've arrived. And as I got to New Zealand, I sat down with my base leader that was there, and I'm sure you guys know this, but New Zealand is the most direct speaking country in the world. And I probably had like a couple of conversations with him, but he was like, hey, let's chat at my house, and went to his house, and I wasn't maybe there for a week now. And he sat me down and he said, Sam, let me just say this to you. You reek of insecurity.
Oh my.
All right. Yeah. I was like, excuse me? And he was like, yeah, mate. He was like, you're so insecure. He was like, you just reek of insecurity. He's like, I know it because I used to be so insecure too. And so I feel like I have a pretty good like awareness of that. And he was like, in this community, I just want to promise you that I will never promote you until you deal with your crap.
Oi, oi, oi.
And I was like,
welcome to New
I was
Zealand.
like, in my mind, I was like, oh, you want to play it that way? And I was like, all right. And so, I left and I was like, all right. He doesn't know me. He doesn't know who I am. He was like, he just barely met me and said all this stuff. I was like, how dare he? And of course, there's all this backstory of, I was really insecure. In Fire and Fragrance, I watched all of my friends get promoted and get prophesied over by Lauren, and they're doing amazing things. And I was just staffing, and I was just serving. I was calling students in our call center, and I just felt so hidden, and I felt so unseen, and so, in one sense, like insignificant. And so then when I got to New Zealand, I was like, finally, I'm doing something significant. And sure enough, he tells me, you're not going to do anything here. And I was like, oh, great. Perfect. My worst nightmare. And one of the girls that I had invited, she was a student in a school I led. She was a staff in one of the schools I led. And then she came with me to New Zealand. And now she was my boss. Perfect. Just a recipe for for me to just celebrate her in all the amazing ways that, you know, I was so proud of her. No, I was so like frustrated because I was like, why is she doing the job I should be doing? And my leader, one of my leaders, ended up coming through New Zealand at the time. And I thought, great, she's going to validate me as a great leader. And hopefully she can rescue me from the prison cell of my leader's scrutiny that I'm insecure. And instead she agreed with him. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, and she was like, yeah, like, she was like, you know, I think Sam does really need breakthrough in this area. And I was like, I'm just like, guys, like, can I get a break here? And you would think that I would probably deal with it, but I didn't. And I just kept running away. And one day,
how did the insecurity look like specifically? Like, what does it look like for a leader or staff like you to be insecure in that sense?
Yeah, I was incredibly insecure. So it came out in a lot of ways. It came out where I was I really cared about my position. Didn't say it, but I did. I cared about who was celebrating me, how well I spoke. I cared about, you know, did I see more salvations than someone else? Was I doing something awesome versus everyone else in the room? When I walked into a room, where can I be to be the most like significant? Where can I be around, or who can I be around that's going to help me continually be significant? And I was constantly thinking about how I can position myself to do significant things. And it was predominantly what dominated my mind. And so even some of my relationships was all around what I can get, how this is going to help me climb this invisible ladder I made in my mind, and to do things that I thought was important. And it also affected in invisible ways that I never thought, because I was so blind to it. I thought no one could tell I was insecure. That's what I believed. No one, and I deceived myself. I was like, I'm not insecure. I'm totally confident. I'm confident. And I was like, yeah, who cares? But inside I was like, I really care. But one day I got engaged to my fiance at the time, who is now my wife, praise God. So it's a good ending.
Good.
And she called me, and I could tell that she'd been crying. And I was like, oh no. And she was like, hey, I need to talk to you. And that's like the last thing that any guy would want to hear.
100%.
And I hear from the background on her phone, tell him what you told us. And I was like, oh no. And I was like, this just smells like an intervention. And it's my bass leader. And basically he was just like, tell him what you told us. And she was like, I think it's probably best if you come over, and I want to talk to you. I was like, okay. And so I get in my car, I drove over to my bass leader's house, and I was like, oh, this is the worst day of my life. And I'm so afraid of losing her, right? Because I was like, what's wrong? What did I do? And I sit down and I walk into their house, and my bass leader and his wife are sitting on this side. My fiance is sitting on the other side. And I was like, this is 100% intervention. And I was like, oh no, this is bad. So I sat down, and my fiance just begins to share, as my bass leader was like, hey, why don't you tell him what you told us? And she was like, Sam, I love you and I want to marry you. But I've tried to bring this to you. Marty has tried to bring this to you. Andy has tried to bring this to you. Your friends have tried to bring this to you, and you won't listen. And she said, I can't be married to a man who is unwilling to deal with his issues. I can't be led by a man who won't confront his issues. So she said, either you deal and start to deal with your issues, not that you're perfect, but I need you to deal with your issues, or I cannot marry you. And I was like, I remember just like my jaw just dropped, like, dang, I can't run away. And I just thought, like, this is it. I have to, either I lose her or have to do the very thing I've never wanted to do. And so I said, okay, I'll deal with my issues. And that was so like, my response was terrible. I think I said, okay, I probably have some insecurity. That's how much humility I could muster up. I was like, really? You couldn't have just said like, you're right, I'm sorry, And anyways, I come a long way. And I, left that meeting, went home, and I remember just like, didn't sleep well that night. I was just like, what do I do? I called my leader the next morning. I was like, all right, so I'm insecure. What do I do? And he goes, I don't know. You have to ask God. And I was like, you've been telling me I'm insecure and you have no advice. You have no practical solutions. You have nothing to give me. Just, I don't know. I was like, what a terrible leader. And he was like, you just have to ask God, mate. Like, he's going to be the one that tells you. And I was like, ugh. So I remember I went upstairs, sat on the balcony, and I was like, all right, God, here I am, your insecure son. What do I do? And I felt like he said, make it right with your friends. And I was like, why? I was like, there's nothing wrong there. And he said, make it right. And I was like, okay. So I just thought like, well, I'm just going to invite them over and probably a short meeting, and I'll just carry on. And so I invited that girl I told you about that was my leader. She was a girl that I was leading, and then she ended up leading me. So I invited her and her fiance, who was my roommate at the time, invited them over. And I was like, hey, I know this is crazy. Probably doesn't make sense. And I was like, but I've been really convicted and realized that I need to deal with my insecurity. And if there's any way that my insecurity has affected you, I just want to repent. And she broke down crying. And I was like, oh no. And I had no idea I had hurt her this much. And she said, when I was asked to take the position, I didn't want it. And as soon as I took it, I was hoping that you as my leader would be my greatest cheerleader. But you became my greatest enemy. Because she said, I can feel you withholding from me. And I can feel your jealousy over the position I never wanted that you felt you deserved.
Whoa.
I was like,
Dang.
I was like, oh no. And I remember in that moment, and maybe this is going to make sense for everyone who's listening, that my private sin, I was hoping would only have private consequences. But sin never has only private consequences. It will always have a public consequence. And it always will affect the people that you love most. And it affected her. It affected my fiance. It affected the people that I held dear. And to make matters even crazier, her fiance, this 6'4" stout Kiwi guy, stands up, and I was like, great, he's gonna punch me in the face. I was like, I'm gonna die. And he gets up, walks out of the room, and I was like, oh no. And he comes back in, and he has this bowl, and he gets down and he washes my feet, and I just wept.
Goosebumps.
Yeah. And he wept, and he just said, Sam, I forgive you and I love you. And he said, I want you to know, Sam, we've always prayed for you to come to understand how amazing you are.
Oy.
And I was just like, oh, what the heck? And yeah, like it was just this moment that I was like, wow, like I didn't deserve that. My fiance was crying. We're all crying. And it just so moved me that I was like, man, I was just such a jerk. I had no idea. I was such a jerk. And yet they just celebrated me. They fought for me when I just didn't deserve it. And I wish I could tell you, I was like, in that day, I never, ever felt insecure ever again. I was like, no, definitely not. It was just a daily choice. And the choice was, do I believe what God says over my life, or do I believe in the lie? Do I believe that I am who he says I am, or do I believe in the lie of who I'm not? And it was me daily choosing truth, daily choosing this is who I am, daily choosing. And that over time, I began to settle into the truth of what God said.
How was your then fiance kind of what can I say, reacting or responding to you taking responsibility? Yeah, after that. That doesn't even have to be a pod question, but I genuinely
I'm curious.
yeah.
I mean, it was, I think one of the reasons why I fell in love with my wife was when even before we started dating, I don't know, maybe this is, I remember I freaked out. So I was really, interested. I wanted to date her, but as soon as it got to dating her, I freaked out. Because I was like, am I making the wrong choice? Is this right? Is this really what I want? And I remember feeling so paralyzed. And in that whole process, she just remained so steadfast. And she was like, hey, I'm here if you need. And it's okay no matter what. But I just want you to know I'm here. And just, it was like that for, unfortunately, weeks where I was just freaking out, and I wasn't sure. We were moving to New Zealand together, and we were going to start dating, and I was like, we're moving to a different country and I'm dating her. I was like, this is such a huge deal, and if I break her heart while we move, I was like, this is disaster. And I remember just feeling so afraid, and I fell in love with her because of how steadfast that she was that whole time. And throughout that whole time, when I was starting to take responsibility, really dealing with my insecurity, and in one sense, I was like, I felt so naked and weak and vulnerable. And she just remained the same, and she was just there for me.
Sounds like a legend.
Yeah. And then you eventually get married.
Yeah.
And you've been married for how many years?
This upcoming August would be our 10th year anniversary.
Hey,
Congrats.
Thank you.
In advance. So how is, do you have any good tips for married life, or wisdom from being married?
One of the best things that Andy told me before I got married was the strongest glue to any marriage is a great friendship. And so, we talk about all of these different words for love that most people will be familiar with. And there is a lie that the world tells us that the eros love in the Greek, or the erotic love, the sensual love, is what holds a relationship together, but it's actually not true. The strongest that will keep a marriage healthy is friendship. And friendship through the years, through storms, through hard moments, easy moments, has been what kept my wife and I, where today I can gladly say, I honestly don't remember the last time we've had an argument. I don't remember, in terms of a fight, or one of those long-winded arguments. We'll have a disagreement and we'll work it out, but it's not like a fight. And I don't honestly remember the last fight we've had. And I'm not saying that we'll never have one, and I'm not saying that we are perfect. We're not. But in some ways, I can definitely say we're a very healthy couple and a very healthy family. And both of us come from broken families. We come from divorced parents. And there are often times where we're on a date or we're just hanging out, and I'll look over and I'm like, what the heck? How did we get such a great marriage? And she's like, honestly, I don't know. She's like, I feel like we got given this gift of a great marriage. And, during the pandemic, for us in where we were, it was really challenging. And my wife was the COVID point person over our whole campus, and I was the training point over the whole campus. And it was so hard. It was difficult. I mean, no decision we ever made was okay. It was always a bad decision. It was always the wrong decision because someone was always mad about it. And many people were always mad about it no matter what we decided. And even in that difficult season, we grew closer together, and we just continually leaned into one another. And so I would say that one of the strongest encouragements and things that I believe has really helped us over the years is a strong friendship. You can't skip that part. And also it is the glue. And so that's why we always recommend to young couples where they're dating to slow down in your physical intimacy. And it's not because of just the running away from sin, which is still helpful, but it's also so that you can really allow the foundation of a strong friendship to develop before you introduce other things.
Wow.
Sick.
Great tips. Were you ever insecure for your own future marriage coming from a divorced household? And like, because I think that's a trap many people can go into if you're from a past hurt with divorce and stuff. Like,
100%.
I'm not gonna experience a healthy relationship, and I'm also gonna get divorced. Almost like, did you experience that?
Oh, 100%. I was definitely afraid of getting divorced.
And your wife also, maybe, or?
Yeah, and she did too. More of her fear was a little bit before we got married of making the wrong choice, which is a different story. But I was afraid because my greatest fear was when my mom used to tell me when I was younger, she was like, your dad was a phenomenal husband for the first 2 years, and then he just changed, and it became very difficult in our relationship and him as a father. And so I had this fear that somehow magically 2 years into our marriage that I would somehow become this different person. And so I was just like, I just had this like kind of fear that somehow something would happen. And praise God, like I haven't done that at all, but I remember just having all these fears. But looking back to, and this is, I know that it's not always a possibility for everyone, but living with a healthy family did change my life. And I remember living with Andy, they've been married for over 20 years now, and they've never once raised their voices at one another in 20 years. They've never walked out in an argument on one another. They've never, they've never had, wild moments, in their marriage in 20 years. And I remember just being in their house and kind of thinking it was fake. It was so like healthy. I was like, I know that people talk to each other that way. I've never seen, a husband and wife speak so respectfully to one another and honor one another and love each other the way that they do. And, quick testimony was, now that my wife and I, we've been almost married for 10 years, and we spent about a month living with my mom just recently because we were looking for a place to live in California. And my mom, towards the end of our time with her, she was like, Sam, one of the things I've noticed about your relationship with your wife was I love how honoring you guys are to one another all the time. That you speak really respectfully to one another and to your kids. And she was like, that's incredible. And I thought, my mom would have never really seen us like really in that dynamic being married for that amount of time. And I think that's a testimony to both my wife and I and what we have witnessed and seen, living in community, being really open and vulnerable in our discipleship, and allowing the Lord to form us and shape us, that prepared us, for marriage.
Wow, that's awesome. And then Yeah, I think even just because not everyone has the opportunity to live with a family, but knowing that there is healthy ways of doing family and marriage, and knowing it is possible.
That's right.
Almost like look at Andy Bird and they're making it, then you can also make it. Almost.
Yeah, that's right.
That's awesome. I think we're trying to wrap up now.
Yeah.
But do you have like a gold nugget that you would tell 20-year-old Sam Chang or the listeners or someone?
Yeah. If I were to tell 20-year-old Sam today, man, I would just tell him to keep dreaming and take great risks with God.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, to not be such in a rush. That to allow the Lord to do what he wants to. And yeah.
Super cool. Sam, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing and all of that. Would you want
guys.
to come on, so epic, so fun also.
Yeah.
Would you want to pray for us in the end?
Would love to.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. Father, I just thank you for every person that's listening to this podcast, as well as my friends here. And I just thank you for our time together. I thank you that I ask that you would really be honored through our lives, that you would be honored through our obedience and following you. I ask that every word that was spoken today, that we ask that it would honor you. And I just thank you for every person that has listened in, has been impacted through this podcast. And I just ask that you would continually make yourself known, that you would, out of their wildest imaginations, that you would continually meet them, even as they're driving, even as they're listening to some of these stories late at night. I ask, would you encounter their hearts? In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.